Matter and Memory by Henri Bergson. Chapter 1. Of the Selection of Images for Conscious Presentation. What our body means and does. We will assume for the moment that we know nothing of the theories of matter and theories of spirit, nothing of the discussions as to the reality or ideality of the external world. Here, I am in the presence of images, in the vaguest sense of the word. Images perceived when my senses are open to them, unperceived when they are closed. All these images act and react upon one another in all their elementary parts according to constant laws which I call laws of nature. And as a perfect knowledge of these laws would probably allow us to calculate and to foresee what will happen in each of these images. The future of the images must be contained in their present. It will add to them nothing new. And there is one of them which is distinct from all others, in that I do not know it from without by perception, but from within by affections. It is my body. I examine the conditions in which these affections are produced. I find that they always interpose themselves between the excitations that I receive from without and the movements which I am about to execute, as though they had some undefined influence on the final issue. I pass in review my different affections. It seems to me that each of them contains, after its kind, an invitation to act, which at the same time leave to wait and even to do nothing. I look closer. I find movements begun, but not executed, the indication of a more or less useful decision, but not that constraint which precludes choice. I call up, I compare my recollections. I remember that everywhere in the organic world, I have thought I saw this same sensibility appear at the very moment when nature, having conferred upon the living being the power of mobility in space, gives warning to the species by means of sensation of the general dangers which threaten it, leaving it to the individual the precautions necessary for escaping from them. Lastly, I interrogate my consciousness as to the part which it plays in affection. Consciousness replies that it is present indeed in the form of feeling or of sensation at all the steps in which I believe that I take the initiative, and that it fades and disappears as soon as my activity, by becoming automatic, shows that consciousness is no longer needed. Therefore, either all these appearances are deceptive, or the act in which the affective state issues is not one of those which might be rigorously deduced from the antecedent phenomena, as a movement from a movement, and hence it really adds something new to the universe and to its history. Let us hold to the appearances. I will formulate purely and simply what I feel and what I see. All seems to take place as if in these aggregates of images which I call the universe, nothing really new could happen except through the medium of certain particular images, the type of which is furnished by my body. This opening section of Matter and Memory, this first section of chapter 1, is really a jam-packed beginning to this book. It puts together so many of the themes and ideas that Bergson will weave throughout this chapter, and I find this chapter to be both very difficult and very compelling. His way of writing is to start us on a certain path and then bring in new ideas and then develop them, but then to often stop and turn and discuss questions from the history of metaphysics, such as the debate between idealism and realism, and then to move somewhat seamlessly from that historical discussion back to the path he was on, where he was developing his own ideas based on certain observations. The chapter is incredibly important, not only in this work, but in Bergson's thinking. It is what establishes for him the beginning of a method that can be productive of what he wants to call metaphysics, like pure truths. He does it by attempting to reformulate how we approach our immediate given facts of observation. As thinking beings who observe the world and observe our bodies and have memories and that want to understand reality, how are we to take that given set of facts and derive from our observation, from our experience, truth about reality? And he thinks that if he can redefine matter, approach matter in its reality, then he will be able to establish something like a philosophical or metaphysical knowledge. And in this passage I just read, he addresses three realities, which are going to be constant themes of the chapter. The first is matter, or matter images. The image of matter, the experience of matter, the appearance of matter, matter as it is given. The second reality is the body. Is not an object that we study, an image that we look at external to us. No, the body is a lived image, which he calls a sort of image kaleidoscope. So not the image itself, but a kaleidoscopic organization among images. When you turn a kaleidoscope, all of the parts of the image change together as a whole, because it's really a series of mirrors shining the same part of whatever it's looking at in all directions, right? So the kaleidoscopic image, metaphorically, is like our body's unique perspective on everything that we perceive, not only our, situated perspective in vision, but also having to do with everything about what is relevant to our body as a living being moving around in the world. We perceive things through our body's needs and through our need to adapt to the world and to, extract advantage from the world in order to stay alive. And so our perceptive, sensing, and living body is this kaleidoscope image, or image kaleidoscope, that puts together all of our sensory experience in a way that creates a whole, in a way that organizes it and makes sense of it. And the third reality he addresses is consciousness. And the biggest question with consciousness that unfolds through this chapter has to do with representation. Representation isn't only important for understanding consciousness, but for understanding knowledge, science, matter, the world. It is a metaphysical question and is a foundational question for all thinking. Representation, as we'll see, is going to be sectioned off, we could say, from other modes of presentation, other modes of conscious presentation. So the chapter title is Of the Selection of Images for Conscious Presentation. And so the question of presence is going to be massive here. In order to think of matter, we cannot think of it as merely a representation. In order to think about the body, we cannot think about it merely as an object present to us, but instead as a process which brings things into presence. And consciousness, not merely as representation, but as unconscious memories and unconscious tendencies. So more consciousness will be more than a representation. And by chapter 3, he will show us that consciousness is also a shift in tension, a change in a certain way of bringing together our memories and our perceptions. And so consciousness is bringing them together. It's making sense of them. It's allowing them to draw out representations and create images and make decisions and things like that. But it's also the shift in perspective, the shift in intentionality, the change of motivation and new ways of bringing our memories together. But we'll get to that later. And so the main point that Bergson wants to make about representation and consciousness is that consciousness arises in our practical engagement with the world. And I've already touched on this a little bit with the idea of the body. We perceive things as functions of our needs, as our body is getting around in the world and interacting with others and things like that. So our consciousness is something that comes along through that very system, that practical, utility-driven way of interacting with the world. Consciousness is therefore practical knowledge, and both perception and consciousness should not be thought of as knowledge that is disinterested in its object. They arise through interest, through what he will call the attention to life. So these three realities, matter, body, and consciousness, are going to be the core subject matter of this chapter. How can we understand matter? How can we understand the body? How can we understand consciousness? And paired with each of these, perhaps, is sensation, affection, and recollection. Matter is what we have in our senses immediately. It is what we are a part of immediately through our body. Affection is the kaleidoscopic image of our being in the world. It is our way of organizing all of the meaning and appearances in a way that, imbues all of them with the same emotion, right? Affection. Recollection, Bergson is going to make essential to consciousness as the most primary. So memory is going to be the most primary form of consciousness. And in this passage, he says, recollection reminds me that everywhere in the organic world, I have thought I saw the same sensibility appear at the very moment when nature, having conferred upon the living being the power of mobility in space, gives warning to the species by means of sensations of the general dangers which threaten it, leaving it to the individual the precautions necessary for escaping from them. So recollection gives us evidence of what he calls the kaleidoscopic image, the organic way of perceiving the world, the way of inhabiting the world as a living thing, and what he'll call living matter. And that through certain complex elaborations of our sensory faculties, our sensory motor abilities, our ability to move around as animals and to perceive, gives us a greater degree of distance from what we are perceiving, and therefore we are capable of having an affect, an affection, of a sense of danger, of a threat that needs to be escaped or something like that, and ability to take precautions. And this is going to be essential in Bergson's thinking about freedom, this ability to widen the gap between what we immediately perceive, how we are moved by the world, and choice, being able to choose among different decisions. So he says, looking closely at this kaleidoscopic image of the body, this way in which we experience the world as organized around our vital needs, he says, I find movement begun but not executed, the indication of a more or less useful decision, but not the constraint which precludes choice. Okay, so this sentence is so fully packed and is something that he's going to try and talk about throughout the entire book. It also comes a little bit from Time and Free Will. He talks a lot about free will, about choice, about how we make decisions in that book. And one of the most important things about how he thinks about freedom is through what we could call nascent movements or tendencies or latent movements. All of these refer to something that doesn't fully exist in the present, something that is not completely actual, right? If we find movements begun but not executed, it means some part of our inner psychic being is moving towards a movement. It hasn't begun to move yet, but it is in a process of beginning that movement and yet hasn't completely actualized it. When we are pausing and looking around our surroundings as animals and hesitating, we are opening more possibilities for movement, right? And we sense, or what he'll call perceive, we perceive possible movements, virtual movements, movements begun but not executed. We begin to perceive possibilities. And, things in the world appear more or less useful. But in this image, we find nothing like that constraint, which precludes choice. That's what he says here. So while in the immediate images that we perceive, there is something like determinacy, determination, determinism. One moment gives way to the next moment. It adds nothing. It takes nothing away. There is a pure reciprocity of causality. All images act and react upon one another in all their elementary parts according to constant laws, which I call the laws of nature. Matter images present us with pure objectivity. What we see already and what we're going to see repeated again and again in these passages is that there are two realities that we can begin with. And one we could call the cosmic image. It is a centerless image of pure movement that includes the entire universe. And he pushes us to think of this as a qualitatively rich, dynamic plenum of movement, imbued with all of the secondary qualities which are commonly removed from matter in mathematical reductive physics. So we have this cosmic image, which is the entire universe without a center. And then we have the kaleidoscopic image, which is centering, and it modifies all other images. It arranges them and it structures them, and as we will see, elicits from them perceptions. But the kaleidoscopic image is always already structured for its utility. And at the end of this passage, he says something really important that really sets the tone for what he's going to do in this book and how he's going to approach these questions throughout this chapter. It all has to do with intuition, which is an idea that comes later in his philosophy, or at least that name comes later. And it is actually central to his work in Matter and Memory and in Time and Free Will before it. It is to, as he says, formulate purely and simply what I feel and what I see. So there's a kind of descriptive act going on here, a philosophical description of what is immediately evident to us, what we can take as giving evidence of reality, of telling us the truth of things. And what he starts with this little italics, he will repeat new insights in italics. He will repeatedly use italics to indicate these. And then he kind of forms from this chain of insights a dialectical move where he goes from this fundamental insight, which he describes in this first italics, that we are in an aggregate of images, which we call the universe, that there's this body image that is kaleidoscopic at its center. And he's going to keep evolving this and engaging it in new questions within the debates of metaphysics between idealism and realism, and in psychology and in physiology and other domains, and in history of philosophy. And each time he evolves and changes and develops this paradigm, this viewpoint, this starting point of placing ourselves in the universe as an aggregate of images, finding out that our body is a kaleidoscopic image, and then from there engaging in what we could call phenomenology of consciousness, reflection on the role, the development, the nature of consciousness, and how we can form new kinds of concepts, new kinds of ideas that don't fall into the limitations of certain ways of consciousness, extracting reality into representations. So a different way that doesn't think through representations. And I will just read this quick and then we'll move on to the next italic. All seems to take place as if in this aggregate of images, which I call the universe, nothing really new could happen except through the medium of certain particular images, the type of which is furnished me by my body. You may say that my body is matter, or that it is an image. The word is of no importance. If it is matter, then it is part of the material world, and the material world consequently exists around it and without it. If it is an image, that image can give what has been put into it. And since it is, by hypothesis, the image of my body only, it would be absurd to expect to get from it that of the whole universe. My body, an object destined to move other objects, is then a center of action, cannot give birth to a representation. So Bergson is looking at the universe as movement. This matter, this image, is an image of movement. It is a continuous flux. And we experience this as embodied, as having a body that itself moves and is a center of action. So what he wants to do is look at reality in terms of movement and the cosmos as a plane of movement and our body as a center of action that modifies movements and puts together its perception of the entire universe in a way that is centered around its activity and its movement. The body and our perception is not giving birth to a representation. It is also not putting together a plurality of sense data, these unextended pieces of information, as psychologists and empirical psychology had been talking about in his time and ever since David Hume. They treat the brain as a thing existing in the world of images, but as an image which produces a representation. And the representation is this subjective, unextended experience, while the images are denuded of their qualities that we have in perception, and the brain is then thought to create representations. He says the afferent nerves are images, the brain is an image, and the disturbance traveling through the sensory nerves and propagated in the brain is an image too. If the image, which I term cerebral disturbance, really begot external images, it could contain them in one way or another, and the representation of the whole material universe would be implied in that of this molecular movement. To state the proposition is enough to show its absurdity. The brain is part of the material world. The material world is not part of the brain. Eliminate the image which bears the name material world, you destroy at the same time the brain and the cerebral disturbance, which are parts of it. Suppose, on the contrary, that these two images, the brain and the cerebral disturbance, vanish. By hypothesis, you efface only these, that is to say, very little, an insignificant detail from an immense picture. Picture in its totality, that is to say, the whole universe, remains. To make the brain the condition on which the whole image depends is, in truth, a contradiction in terms, since the brain is, by hypothesis, a part of this image. Neither nerves nor nerve centers can, then, condition the image of the universe. Bergson is again telling us to think of the presence which we experience when we perceive matter as existing in an aggregate of images, which he is calling plane of images, which I am calling the cosmic image. Our perceptions are not emerging from our brain in a subjective realm that has nothing in common with the world, mechanical world that created it. We should not ask where the representation occurs. Does it occur in the sense organs? Does it occur in the brain? Is it somehow a reality completely separate from the thing which caused it? This will get us to the metaphysics of a thing in itself. And Bergson will tackle this in due course of the chapter. So instead, we need to think of the brain as a part of a whole. It is part of the whole universe, and it is becoming with the whole universe. And every movement that comes to it from the rest of the universe, and remember, every point in the universe is intertwined with every other point. So every movement is conserved through the entire whole of the universe, and the totality touches every part. But if my body is an object capable of exercising a genuine and therefore a new action upon the surrounding objects, it must occupy a privileged position in regard to them. As a rule, any image influences other images in a manner which is determined and even calculable through what are called the laws of nature. As it has not to choose, so neither has it any need to explore the region about it, nor to try its hand at several merely eventual actions. The necessary action will take place automatically when its hour strikes. But I have supposed that the office of the image which I call my body was to execute on other images a real influence, and consequently to decide which step to take among several which are all materially possible. And since these steps are probably suggested to it by the greater or lesser advantage which it can derive from the surrounding images, these images must display in some way upon the aspect which they present to my body the profit which my body can gain from them. The more I narrow this horizon, the more the objects which it circumscribes space themselves out distinctly according to the greater or lesser ease with which my body can touch and move them. They send back, then, to my body, as would a mirror, its eventual influence. They take rank in an order corresponding to the growing or decreasing powers of my body. The objects which surround my body reflect its possible action upon them. The question of habit has now arisen more explicitly. There is a habit of the body to extract pictures, to extract representations, and to send movements and to impede movements. The brain, according to Bergson, is primarily responsible for this selection of movements. So we will have a movement transmitted to our body and then to the brain and to the spinal cord. And then it passes through the cerebral membranes and another movement will come back out of it. And this is our behavior. And what Bergson thinks the brain is doing is habituating the delay, the inhibition, and the lack of inhibition, the allowing for a certain movement to trigger a certain sensory motor habit. Perception will prove to be deeply rooted in habit in this sense, so we will only perceive what we can habituate and automate responses to. Movements from all corners of the plane of immanence, this movement image, the cosmic image, come to a center and move through that center, but instead of simply being returned with an opposite and contrary reaction, the movement is delayed and multiple movements are opened as possibilities for the return movement. And this all has to do with the complexity of our living body, of our animal bodies, as having mobility and the ability to, foresee danger and evade it, or to take precautions in our movement as we ambulate. So Bergson's making 2 points here. One is that when we cut the nerves, we are not destroying a device that creates representations. We are destroying the passageway of movements going from the periphery to the center, and in the center they can be delayed and nascent movements can begin that aren't actualized, and in that hesitation within this zone of indetermination, as he's going to call it, the movement can be delayed and then returned from the center to the periphery through our action, through our sensory motor, or as he says, ideomotor activity. So here's a quick diagram to help us understand this. We have the center of action, which exists within the cosmic image. And we start from the cosmic image, and then we find this kaleidoscopic change that occurs when the body moves around as a center of action. And then we have all these movements which are coming to the center of action from every corner of the cosmic image. But some of them are making their way through and creating behaviors in us. And while they are linking through all of these threads of movement that come through us, there are interruptions as they pass through the center in what he calls the zone of indetermination, which creates a hesitation, a delay, an inhibition, and the possibility of many actions being nascently present to our perception and influencing the way that we perceive all of these movements. And what he's going to say is our perception just is that delaying of action within our zone of indetermination. Now, the system of images in which the scalpel has effected only the insignificant change is what is generally called the material world. And on the other hand, that which has just vanished is my perception of matter. Whence, provisionally, these two definitions. I call matter the aggregate of images, and perception of matter these same images referred to the eventual action of one particular image, my body. It must be stated as follows. Here is a system of images which I term my perception of the universe, and which may be entirely altered by a very slight change in a certain privileged image, my body. This image occupies the center. By it, all the others are conditioned. At each of its movements, everything changes, as though by a turn of a kaleidoscope. Here, on the other hand, are the same images, but referred each one to itself, influencing each other, no doubt, but in such a manner that the effect is always in proportion to the cause. This is what I term the universe. The question is, how can these two systems coexist? And why are the same images relatively invariable in the universe and infinitely variable in perception? The problem at issue between realism and idealism, perhaps even between materialism and spiritualism, should be stated then, it seems to me, in the following terms. How is it that the same images can belong at the same time to two different systems, one in which each image varies for itself and in the well-defined measure that it is patient of the real action of surrounding images, and another in which all images change for a single image and in varying measure that they reflect the eventual action of this privileged image? Every image is within certain images and without others. But of the aggregate of images, we cannot say that it is within us or without us, since interiority and exteriority are only relations among images. To ask whether the universe exists only in our thought or outside our thought is to put the problem in terms that are unsolvable. Even if we suppose them to be intelligible, it is to condemn ourselves to a barren discussion in which the terms thought, being, universe will always be taken on either hand in entirely different senses. To settle the matter, we must first find a common ground where combatants may meet, and since on both sides it is agreed that we can only grasp things in the form of images, we must state the problem in terms of images and images alone. The question raised between realism and idealism, then, becomes quite clear. What are the relations which these two systems of images maintain with each other? And it is easy to see that subjective idealism consists in deriving the first system from the second, materialistic realism in deriving the second from the first. The realist starts, in fact, from the universe. That is to say, from an aggregate of images governed as to their mutual relation by fixed laws in which effects are the strict proportion to their causes and of which the character is an absence of center, all the images unfolding on one another and the same plane indefinitely prolonged. But he is at once bound to recognize that besides this system, there are perceptions. That is to say, systems in which the same images seem to depend on a single one among them, around which they range themselves on different planes, so as to be wholly transformed by the slightest modification of the central image. But this deduction, neither realism nor idealism can succeed, because neither of the two systems of images is implied in the other, and each of them is sufficient to itself. If you posit the system of images which has no center, and in which each element possesses its absolute dimension and value, I see no reason why to this system should occur a second, in which each image has an undetermined value, subject to all the vicissitudes of a central image. You must, then, to engender perceptions, conjure up some deus ex machina, such as the materialist hypothesis of the epiphenomenal consciousness, whereby you choose among all the images that vary absolutely and that you posit to begin with, the one which we term our brain, conferring on the internal state of this image the singular and inexplicable privilege of adding to itself a reproduction, this time relative and variable, of all other things. It is true that you afterwards pretend to attach no importance to this representation, to see in it a mere phosphorescence which the cerebral vibrations leave behind them, as if the cerebral matter and cerebral vibration set in the image which compose this representation could be of another nature than they are. All realism is thus bound to make perception an accident and consequently a mystery. But inversely, if you posit a system of unstable images disposed about a privileged center and profoundly modify by trifling displacements of this center, you begin by excluding the order of nature, that order which is indifferent to the point which we take our stand and to the particular end from which we began. We will have to bring back this order by conjuring up in our turn a deus ex machina. I mean that you will have to assume by an arbitrary hypothesis some sort of pre-established harmony between things and mind, or at least, to use Kant's term, between sense and understanding. Let us start then from this indetermination as from a true principle, and try whether we can deduce from it the possibility and even the necessity of conscious perception. In other words, let us posit that system of closely linked images which we call the material world, and imagine here and there within the system centers of real action represented by living matter. What we mean to prove is that there must be, ranged around each one of these centers, images that are subordinated to the position and variable with it, that conscious perception is bound to occur, and that, moreover, it is possible to understand how it arises. To deduce consciousness would be, indeed, a bold undertaking, but it is really not necessary here, because by positing the material world, we assume an aggregate of images, and moreover, because it is impossible to assume anything else. No theory of matter escapes this necessity. Reduce matter to atoms in motion. These atoms, though denuded of physical qualities, are determined only in relation to an eventual vision and eventual contact, the one without light, the other without materiality. Condense atoms into centers of force, dissolve them into vortices revolving in a continuous fluid. This fluid, these movements, these centers can themselves be determined only in relation to an impotent touch, an ineffectual impulse, a colorless light. They are still images. It is true that an image may be without being perceived. It may be present without being represented. And the distance between these two terms, presence and representation, seems just to measure the interval between matter itself and our conscious perception of matter. But let us examine the point more closely and see in what this difference consists. If there were more in the second term than in the first, if in order to pass from presence to representation it were necessary to add something, the barrier would indeed be insurmountable, and the passage from matter to perception would remain wrapped in an impenetrable mystery. It would not be the same if it were possible to pass from the first term to the second by way of diminution, and if the representation of an image were less than its presence. For it would then suffice that the image present should be compelled to abandon something of themselves in order that their mere presence should convert them into representations. Now, here is an image which I call material object. I have a representation of it. How then does it not appear to be in itself that which it is for me? It is because by being bound up with all other images, it is continued in those which follow it, just as it is prolonged in those which preceded it. To transform its existence into representation, it would be enough to suppress what follows it and what precedes it, and also all that fills it, and to retain only its external crust, its superficial skin. That which distinguishes it as a present image, as an objective reality, from a represented image, is the necessity which obliges it to act through every one of its points upon all the points of other images, and to transmit the whole of what it receives, to oppose to every action an equal and contrary reaction, to be, in short, merely a road by which pass, in every direction, the modifications propagated throughout the immensity of the universe. Now, if living beings are, within the universe, just centers of indetermination, and if the degree of this indetermination is measured by the number and rank of their function, we can conceive that their mere presence is equivalent to the suppression of all those parts of objects in which their functions find no interest. They allow to pass through them, so to speak, the external influences which are indifferent to them. The others, isolated, become perceptions by their very isolation. Everything thus happens for us as though we reflected back to surfaces the light which emanates from them, the light which, had it passed on unopposed, would never have been revealed. The images which surround us will appear to turn towards our body, the side, emphasized by the light upon it, which interests our body. They will detach from themselves that which we have arrested on its way, that which we are capable of influencing. Indifferent to each other because of the radical mechanism that binds them together, they present each to the other all their sides at once, which means that they act and react mutually by all their elements, and that none of them perceives or is perceived consciously. Suppose, on the contrary, that they encounter somewhere a certain spontaneity of reaction. Their action is so far diminished, and this diminution of their action is just the representation which we have of them. A representation of things would thus arise from the fact that they are thrown back and reflected by our freedom. Build up the universe with atoms. Each of them is subject to the action, variable in quantity and quality, according to the distance exerted on it by all material atoms. Bring in Faraday's centers of force. The lines of force emitted in every direction from every center bring to bear upon each the influence of the whole world. Call up Leibniz's monads. Each is the mirror of the universe. All philosophers then agree on this point. Only if, when we consider any other given place in the universe, can we regard the action of all matter as passing through it without resistance and without loss, and the photograph of the whole as translucent. Here there is wanting behind the plate, the black screen on which the image could be shown. Our zones of indetermination play in some sort the part of the screen. They add nothing to what is there. They affect merely this, that real action passes through and virtual action remains. All right, let me unpack a little bit what he means by virtual action and this idea of reflection. He's drawing on a metaphor from a physical experience and something described in science, which is the propagation of movement from one medium to another, which causes refraction. He says that movement that is fully impeded is reflected. It bounces back off and cannot pass, it cannot propagate from one medium to another. And when the movements that come in through our perception, this disturbance, they can be impeded and they can be reflected. And when they are reflected, they linger and become a sort of lure for nascent movements within us. Movements which begin and move towards the periphery, which means virtual actions that begin to realize themselves. If you're thinking about, if you become hungry and you start to think about the food that's in your refrigerator, all of a sudden the movement of your body to the refrigerator, it hasn't been realized yet, but its potential as a virtual action arises as relevant to you. Our virtual actions are the light that illuminates all that we perceive. It is only in light of our sensory motor activities, our ability to sense and move around, that we perceive the world. And only as a lived significance, an implicit assumed need that causes this resistance within us, that resistance to the movement that comes in, and turns it into a picture, an aperçu, this sudden illumination, is this reflection of it being incapable of being the movement of being propagated to another medium. This illuminates this future potential, perception being the function of our action. It is a virtual action which contracts multiplicity, a multiplicity of movements, to make us perceive qualities. This doesn't mean that qualities emerge by being contracted. They don't mysteriously emerge like a representation does in the theories of realism and idealism that Bergson refutes. No, the perceptions, these qualities, exist within the images themselves, independently of our active perception, but they are virtual, potential qualities when they are within the plane of images in the universe. There's no perception, but all of the perceptible qualities are already there, fully ripened, you could say. He says, developed like a photo, already developed. We don't need to develop them in our sensory organs. What we need to do is to reflect them. An actual movement becomes a virtual movement, and a virtual potential for perception becomes an actual perception when reflected. They only become conscious presentations when there is this active sensory motor system at work in the world, and when this movement which comes in is opened to a multiplicity of possible reactions. This is essential to all of this. We do not have perception unless we have a multiplicity of possible reactions. And this perception is then less than the total movement that the body encounters as part of the cosmic image. It's only a part of the influx into our perceptive apparatus. It is a small fraction of this centripetal movement. And it only reflects back, so it's not like a mirror, it only reflects back part of this movement. It only reflects back, let's say, blue light or something like that. A blue mirror would only reflect back blue light. So it's like that. It's only reflecting back whatever is relevant to the body and to our needs. We filter out what is irrelevant and we leave what is relevant, and that is what lingers. That is what is reflected. That is what we perceive. And the nascent movements that this perception illuminates are linked always to our habituation. Everything shows up as a correlate to the sensitivity or the motricity of our bodies. Here, we put a finger on a mistake of those who maintain that perception springs from what is properly called the sensory vibration, and not from a sort of question addressed to motor activity. They sever this motor activity from the perceptive process, and it appears to survive the loss of perception. They conclude that perception is located in the nervous element termed sensory. But the truth is that perception is no more in the sensory center than in the motor center. It measures the complexity of their relation and is, in fact, where it appears to be. Psychologists who have studied infancy are well aware that a representation is at first impersonal. Only little by little, and as a result of experience, does it adopt our body as a center and become our representation. The mechanism of this process is, moreover, easy to understand. As my body moves in space, all the other images vary, while that image, my body, remains invariable. I must, therefore, make it a center to which I refer all the other images. My belief in an external world cannot come from the fact that I project outside myself sensations that are unextended. How could these sensations ever acquire extension? And whence should I get the notion of extensity? But if we allow that, as experience testifies, the aggregate of images is given to begin with, I can see clearly how my body comes to occupy, within this aggregate, a privileged position. And I understand also whence arises the notion of interiority and exteriority, which is, to begin with, merely the distinction between my body and other bodies. For if you start from my body, as is usually done, you will never make me understand how impressions received on the surface of my body, impressions which concern that body alone, are able to become, for me, independent objects and form an external world. But if, on the contrary, all images are posited at the outset, my body will necessarily end by standing out in the midst of them as a distinct thing, since they change unceasingly and it does not vary. The distinction between the inside and the outside will then be only a distinction between the part and the whole. There is, first of all, the aggregate of images, and then, in this aggregate, there are centers of action from which the interesting image appears to be reflected. Thus, perceptions are born and actions made ready. My body is that which stands out as the center of these perceptions. My personality is the being to which these actions must be referred. The whole subject becomes clear if we travel thus from the periphery to the center, as the child does, and as we ourselves are invited to do by immediate experience and by common sense. On the contrary, everything becomes obscure. The problems are multiplied on all sides if we attempt, with the theorist, to travel from the center to the periphery. Whence arises then this idea of an external world constructed artificially, piece by piece, out of unextended sensations, though we can neither understand how they come to form an extended surface, nor how they are subsequently projected outside of the body. Why insist, in spite of appearances, that I should go from my conscious self to my body, then from my body to other bodies, whereas, in fact, I place myself at once in the material world in general, and then gradually cut out within it the center of action, which I shall call my body, and to distinguish from all others. There are so many illusions gathered round this belief in the originally unextended character of our external perceptions. There are, in the idea that we project outside ourselves, states which are purely internal. So many misconceptions, so many lame answers to badly stated questions that we cannot hope to throw light on the whole subject at once. We believe that light will increase as we show more clearly, behind these illusions, the metaphysical error which confounds pure perception with memory. But the illusions are, nevertheless, connected with real facts, which we may here indicate in order to correct their interpretation. Now, Bergson goes on to show how we fix images in a certain way because of our perceptive habits, and that our senses need education, and we are educated into a way of perceiving through our practical life. And so too, in order to do philosophy and to do this sort of reflection on our immediate experience as living bodies of matter, of consciousness, we are going to need to rehabituate our modes of perceiving. And the other big idea that was in this passage that we just heard is about the direction we move from assuming these things that we've heard Bergson repeat over and over again at this point. Assume that we start in this cosmic image, the whole of the universe, and then from there move to the body as the kaleidoscopic image, the center. So go from the periphery to the center. And he thinks that the metaphysics behind both realism and idealism starts with the body as the center, and particularly for empiricist realism, the body is really the surface of the body, which is this objective world in contact with our body. That is what we perceive, right? And this disturbance on the surface of the body somehow becomes a inextended quality, something subjective. So we move from the center to the periphery. We move from an objective body to this inextended quality, which is projected outward as the external world. And we'll hear Bergson repeat this idea that it's really matters which direction we go in. It will be only false problems that arise from starting from the body, starting from our internal experience, and trying to construct an external world. The representation of the external world, this virtual image of the cosmic whole, is not produced by the mind in the mind and projected outward. It is what is deposited in the zone of indetermination as it passes through, as movements pass through that center and are resisted and reflected, deposited. The psychologist starts, in fact, from his body. And as the impressions received at the periphery of his body seem to him sufficient for the reconstruction of the entire material universe, to his body he at first reduces the universe. But this first position is not tenable. His body has not and cannot have any more or any less reality than all other bodies. So he must go further, follow to the end the consequence of his principle. And after having narrowed the universe to the surface of the living body, contract this body itself into a center, which he will end up by supposing unextended. Then from this center will start unextended sensations, which will swell, so to speak, will grow into extensity, and will end by giving extension first to his body and afterward to all other material objects. But this strange supposition would be impossible if there were not, in point of fact, between images and ideas, the former extended and the latter unextended, a series of intermediate states, more or less vaguely localized, which are the affective states. Now, we have considered the living body as a kind of center, whence is reflected on the surrounding objects the action which these objects exercise upon it. In that reflection, external perception consists. But this center is not a mathematical point. It is a body, exposed, like all natural bodies, to the action of external causes which threaten to disintegrate it. We have just seen that it resists the influence of those causes. It does not merely reflect action received from without. It struggles and thus absorbs some part of this action. Here is the source of affection. We might therefore say, metaphorically, that while perception measures the reflecting power of the body, affection measures its power to absorb. Everything becomes clearer, on the other hand, if we start from representation itself. That is to say, from the totality of the perceived images. My perception in its pure state, isolated from memory, does not go on from my body to other bodies. It is, to begin with, in the aggregate of bodies, then gradually limits itself and adopts my body as a center. And it is led to do so precisely by experience of the double faculty which this body possesses, performing actions and feeling affections. In a word, it is led to do so by experience of the sensory motor power of a certain image, privileged among other images. For, on the one hand, this image always occupies the center of representation, so that other images range themselves round it in the very order in which they might be subjected to its action. On the other hand, I know it from within, by sensations, which I term affective, instead of knowing only, as in the case of other images, its outer skin. There is, then, in the aggregate of images, a privileged image, perceived in its depths and no longer only on the surface, the seat of affection and at the same time the source of action. It is this particular image which I adopt as the center of my universe and as the physical basis of my personality. So we place ourselves at once in the midst of extended images And in the material universe, we perceive centers of indetermination, characteristic of life. In order that action may radiate from these centers, the movements or influences of the other images must be, on the one hand, received, and on the other hand, utilized. Living matter, in its simplest form and in a homogeneous state, accomplishes this function simultaneously with those of nourishment and repair. The progress of such matter consists in sharing this double labor between two categories of organs. The purpose of the first, called the organs of nutrition, being to maintain the second. The second, in their turn, are made of action. They have as their simple type a chain of nervous elements connecting two extremes, of which the one receives external impression and the other executes movement. Thus, to return to the example of visual perception, the office of the rods and cones is merely to receive excitations which will be subsequently elaborated into movements either accomplished or nascent. No perception can result from this, and nowhere in the nervous system are there conscious centers, but perception arises from the same cause which has brought into being the chain of nervous elements with the organs which sustain them and with life in general. It expresses and measures the power of action in the living being and the indetermination of the movements or of the action which will follow the receipt of the stimulus. This indetermination, as we have shown, will express itself in a reflection upon themselves, or better, in a division of the image which surround our body, and as a chain of nervous elements which receives, arrests, and transmits movements, is the seat of this indetermination and gives it measure. Our perception will follow all the details and will appear to express all the variations of the nervous elements themselves. Perception, in its pure state, is then, in very truth, a part of things. We have said that the material world is made up of objects, or, if you prefer it, of images, of which all the parts act and react upon each other by movements. And that which constitutes our pure perception is our dawning action, insofar as it is prefigured in those images. The actuality of our perception thus lies in its activity, in the movement which prolongs it, and not in the greater intensity. The past is only idea, the present is ideomotor. But this is what our opponents are determined not to see, because they regard perception as a kind of contemplation, attribute to it always a pure speculative end, and maintain that it seeks some strange disinterested knowledge, as though, by isolating it from action, and thus severing its links with the real, they were not rendering it both inexplicable and useless. And thenceforth all difference between perception and recollection is abolished, since the past is essentially that which acts no longer, and since, by misunderstanding this characteristic of the past, they become incapable of making a real distinction between it and the present, i.e., that which is acting. No difference but that of mere degree will remain between perception and memory, and neither in the one nor in the other will the subject be acknowledged to pass beyond himself. Restore, on the contrary, the true character of perception. Recognize in pure perception a system of nascent acts which plunges roots deep into the real, and at once perception is seen to be radically distinct from recollections. The reality of things is no more constituted or reconstructed, but touched, penetrated, lived. And the problem at issue between realism and idealism, instead of giving rise to interminable metaphysical discussions, is solved, or rather, dissolved by intuition. This is a rather exceptional passage that really highlights Bergson's ideas and the later developments of his philosophy of intuition. It's key that intuition is sort of beyond perception, it's beyond thinking, and is doing something that, as we'll see, undoes what thinking and perception have done to our mind. Thinking and perception have prepared us for action, for extracting value from the world, and for seeing things in the world as separate individual systems to be manipulated in their movements and anticipated in how they will affect our vital needs. And in this chapter, we see that perception always involves affection. Affection is our emotions, our feelings. Our affections are not things that come from the periphery, right? They're states that bubble up inside us as centers of indetermination, as organized living beings. And for Bergson, these are very much bodily affections. That doesn't mean they aren't also experiential, but they are our ability to endure a movement that cannot be avoided. It is this difference, he says, between the pinprick, which is pricking us, and the pain, which we feel as its prick. Perception starts in the periphery as a cosmic image and then becomes a vivid presence as it is illuminated by utility and habit. Our body is habituated to common stimuli in predictable situations where our habits are already set up to gear us into them in an advantageous way. The pure perception, which would be removed from our affection and our vital needs within the world, would hypothetically be an uninterrupted series of instantaneous visions, which would be part of things rather than of ourselves. But the thing is that we cannot abide in this flux of perception, of pure perception. Instead, we have to see that this reduction to the image, to matter, is impossible to sustain. It always presupposes and is succeeded by the life of our memory, our ability to string together memories, and not just be in every single moment of pure sensation. Memory is more than the present perception, it is more than the affection, and it is more than an image. It is more even than movement and change, and therefore will give rise to an entire new set of questions and investigations for Bergson, moving into parts 2 and 3 of the book. Let us put the same statement in clearer language. We maintain that matter has no occult or unknowable power, and that it coincides in essentials with pure perception. Therefore, we conclude that the living body in general, and the nervous system in particular, are only channels for transmission of movements, which, received in the form of stimulation, are transmitted in the form of action, reflex, or voluntary. That is to say, it is vain to attribute to the cerebral substance property of engendering representations. Now, the phenomenon of memory, in which we believe that we can grasp spirit in its most tangible form, are precisely those of which superficial psychology is most ready to find the origin in cerebral activity, just because they are at the point of contact between consciousness and matter, and because even the adversaries of materialism have no objection in treating the brain as a storehouse of memories. But if it could be positively established that the cerebral process answers only to a small part of memory, that it is rather the effect than the cause, that matter is here as elsewhere the vehicle of an action and not the substratum of a knowledge, then the thesis which we are maintaining would be demonstrated by the very example which is commonly supposed to be the most unfavorable to it, and the necessity might arise of erecting spirit into an independent reality. In this way, also, perhaps some light would be thrown on the nature of what is called spirit and on the possibility of an interaction of spirit and matter. For demonstration of this kind could not be purely negative. Having shown what memory is not, we should have to try to discover what it is. Having attributed to the body the sole function of preparing actions, we are bound to inquire why memory appear to be one with this body, how bodily lesions influence it, and in what sense it may be said to mold itself upon the state of the brain matter. It is, moreover, impossible that this inquiry should fail to give us some information as to the psychological mechanism of memory and the various mental operations connected therein. And inversely, if the problem of pure psychology seemed to acquire some light from our hypothesis, this hypothesis itself will thereby gain in certainty and weight. Everything, then, must happen as if an independent memory gathered images as they successively occur along the course of time, and as if our body, together with its surroundings, was never more than one among these images. The last is that which we obtain at any moment by making an instantaneous section of the general stream of becoming. In this section, our body occupies the center. The things which surround it act upon it, and it reacts upon them. Its reactions are more or less complex, more or less varied, according to the number and nature of the apparatus which experience has set up within it. Therefore, in the form of motor contrivances, and of motor contrivances only, it can store up the action of the past, whence it results that past images, properly so called, must be otherwise preserved, and we may formulate the first hypothesis. The past survives under two distinct forms, first in motor mechanisms, secondly in independent recollections. Bergson puts us back in touch with our pre-personal embeddedness in the cosmic image. He shows us how we are always falling into unconsciousness in our habits, and that our habits become automatic, and our repetition of action is not something spiritual, it's not something consciousness decides, but is a type of inertia. He will follow the flickering of consciousness as it grows in its indetermination, and as memory introduces into the intervals of experience, these intervals become possible because of the physical and behavioral complexity of the organism. Its ability to hesitate allows for a greater degree of memories to be inserted in the interval. And so we see that he has dissolved the false metaphysical problems of realism and idealism, materialism and spiritualism. And he has done this by restoring to matter its rightful place as universal becoming, as the cosmic image, full of all of its intensities and its qualities. And also, on the other hand, he now seeks to restore to spirit its proper place. And he does this as a function of lived duration, of examining his own inner duration, and as memory, and through the investigation of memory.